What if I told you that behind the quiet death of a frail old woman in Bristol was a story of wealth, scandal, betrayal, and secrets so dark they shook the foundations of the British aristocracy? On the morning of May 8, 1969, police entered a small, rather ordinary house on Park Avenue in Bristol. Inside, they found the lifeless body of a 93-year-old woman. The cause? She choked on a chicken bone. To the neighbors, she was simply Mrs. Dennis, a fragile, elderly lady living with her housekeeper. But here's the twist. That woman was Almina Herbert, the 5th Countess of Carnarvon. Yes, the same woman whose fortune once bankrolled the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb and whose life partly inspired the Countess of Grantham in Downton Abbey. Sounds glamorous, right? But the truth was anything but. Behind the diamonds and the castle walls, Almina's life was a storm of illegitimacy, blackmail scandals, adultery trials, whispered abortions in her private nursing homes, and compromises that most people wouldn't survive. The police report from that spring morning paints a haunting picture. A few faded letters tied with ribbon, an empty jewelry box filled only with costume trinkets, and a silver frame showing a grand castle, once hers. Once she held priceless Rothschild treasures and entertained kings. Now, she was just another forgotten woman in a modest Bristol home. Before we go deeper into her incredible rise and tragic fall, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop in the comments where you're watching from. Because trust me, this story is one of the most shocking tales of ambition, deception, and downfall in British high society. Back in the golden days of Victorian England, aristocracy looked untouchable. Estates like Highclere Castle in Hampshire, yes, the real-life Downton Abbey, stood as symbols of power and permanence. With 5,000 acres, endless staff, and lavish banquets, it seemed eternal. But the truth? By the late 1800s, many great families were broke. Crushing debts, collapsing farm incomes, and impossible social expectations meant ruin was always just around the corner. Highclere itself needed over 80 servants to run: the butler, gardeners, cooks, maids. Even the coal bill was enough to bankrupt a middle-class family. Into this fragile, glittering world walked Almina, a woman who wasn't born noble, wasn't even born legitimate. Yet she would become the Countess of Carnarvon, and leave behind a scandal that echoed for nearly a century. London in the 1870s was buzzing with empire, railroads, and raw capitalism. Old aristocrats rubbed shoulders with new money. Railway tycoons, mining giants, and bankers whose fortunes made dukes look poor. The most powerful of all? Alfred de Rothschild, heir to Europe's most legendary banking dynasty. Alfred was fabulously rich, a collector of fine art and host of glittering Mayfair parties. But no matter how much he owned, there was one thing he could never quite buy: acceptance into Britain's oldest and most exclusive aristocratic circles. And that's where this story takes a dramatic turn, because Alfred de Rothschild would orchestrate a secret arrangement that tied his life to that of a bankrupt earl, and to a little girl who wasn't officially his child, but almost certainly his blood. That girl was Almina. Born on April 14, 1876, Almina's birth was wrapped in mystery. The records list her father as Captain Frederick Charles Wombwell, a businessman and ex-army officer, and her mother as a beautiful Frenchwoman named Marie Boyer. But those records were more performance than truth, a carefully staged fiction to cover up the scandal of her illegitimacy. Marie was stunning, cultured and connected to Europe's banking elite. She spoke 4 languages, played piano like a professional, and moved easily in high society. But her marriage to Frederick Wombwell? A disaster. He gambled away fortunes, forged signatures, and drank himself into ruin. By the early 1870s, Marie had separated from him, but in Victorian England, divorce was almost impossible. She was trapped in legal limbo, not free, not independent, and exposed to gossip. Enter Alfred de Rothschild. What began as friendship soon turned into something far deeper. Alfred provided Marie with a house in Mayfair, a lavish allowance, and access to the most exclusive social circles. Publicly, he was introduced as her financial advisor, later as Almina's godfather, but behind closed doors he was far more than that, and so Almina grew up not just with wealth, but with a secret: the illegitimate daughter of one of the richest men in Europe, destined to marry into one of England's most prestigious families. What happened next would change British aristocracy forever, because Almina wasn't just a wealthy, illegitimate child. She became the lifeline for the Carnarvon family. Her fortune, funneled through Rothschild wealth, would keep Highclere Castle alive, bankroll the legendary search for Tutankhamun's tomb, and embroil her in scandals that Victorian society tried desperately to hide. Her story isn't just about money or status. It's about the dangerous bargains people strike when survival is at stake, and the price they pay when ambition consumes everything. Imagine this. A wealthy banker, one of the richest men in Europe, starts pouring money into the life of a married woman, paying her servants, her bills, even funding her dinner parties. Jewelry, fine art, gowns. Nothing was too much. Sounds suspicious, right? That was the situation in 1875 when Alfred de Rothschild took an extraordinary interest in Marie Wombwell. It wasn't just generosity. It was obsession. So when Marie suddenly announced she was pregnant that year, society braced itself. On paper, her husband, Captain Frederick Wombwell, was the father. He was still legally her husband, and in Victorian England that was all that mattered for appearances, but behind closed doors. Everyone knew. The baby, little Almina, looked nothing like Frederick. Instead, she carried Alfred's features and his sharp, calculating intelligence. Even her unusual name, stitched together in a way that seemed to nod at both parents while admitting nothing, whispered the truth. And Alfred didn't even try to hide his attachment. He became godfather to the child, but his interest was far beyond what any godfather would normally show. He bankrolled her upbringing, showered her with gifts, and ensured she grew up in comfort, while Frederick, likely paid off, faded into the background. This was the arrangement that would define Almina's entire existence, a life built on appearances, secrets, and carefully maintained lies. Even as a little girl, people noticed something chilling about Almina. She was unusually sharp, precocious. She had an uncanny ability to read situations, to charm or manipulate when needed. She grew up knowing the world wasn't about truth or virtue. It was about appearances and survival. By the time she turned 17 in 1893, that training had transformed her. Alfred's money and influence had polished her into one of London's most dazzling debutantes. She spoke fluent French, German, and Italian. She played piano almost at a professional level. She knew art, literature, and music well enough to impress the most jaded critics. Her wardrobe, Worth gowns, Cartier jewels, the kind of luxury most aristocratic daughters could only dream of. But here's the catch. Everyone was talking. Alfred's generosity was too obvious. Some gossips even whispered that his relationship with Almina was more than paternal. Others guessed the truth, that she wasn't his goddaughter at all, but his daughter. And they weren't wrong. Alfred himself seemed to confirm it in subtle ways. He set up financial trusts for her future, far beyond what any casual godfather would ever do. And while these whispers swirled, London society itself was changing. The old world of titles and bloodlines was crumbling under the weight of new money. Aristocrats were broke. Heiresses with railroads and mines behind them were suddenly the most valuable commodities on the marriage market. It was a society where marriage wasn't just romance. It was a transaction. And Almina, with Rothschild money at her back, was about to become the most valuable bride in Britain. Enter George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, better known as the future 5th Earl of Carnarvon. On paper, he was everything the aristocracy held dear. Ancient lineage stretching back to the Norman conquest, a family who had served kings for centuries, and the great Highclere Castle is their seat, a place of books, art, and prestige. But peel back the surface, and George was a disaster. By his mid-20s, his debts had exploded past $200,000, millions today. Highclere Castle was bleeding money, the estate couldn't cover the bills, and George was spending wildly on gambling, racing, and endless indulgence. And then there were the scandals. He was whispered to frequent Cairo's opium dens and brothels. Doctors treated him discreetly for continental diseases, code for STDs. Some families pulled their daughters out of social events when they heard he'd be there. One young woman was even rushed into a marriage with another man after a disturbing incident with him. George was broke, reckless, and dangerous. But he had something Almina desperately needed, a title, and so Alfred de Rothschild stepped in once again. He brokered a deal, not a marriage of love, but a transaction. George needed money to survive. Almina needed legitimacy. And Alfred? He needed to secure his daughter's future while finally attaching his name, however indirectly, to the nobility. The negotiations in 1893 and 1894 were cold, calculated, and businesslike. Lawyers, bankers, and family representatives hammered out terms like they were merging two companies. Alfred would pay off all of George's debts and provide an annual income big enough to keep Highclere Castle afloat. In return, George would marry Almina and treat her as a legitimate countess, their children, if any, raised as unquestioned Herberts. It was a deal that suited everyone, and doomed them all. On June 26, 1895, Almina Wombwell married George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, in a grand ceremony at St. Margaret's, Westminster. Society painted it as a love story, a triumph of romance over convention. The newspapers gushed over her beauty, his pedigree, the glittering guest list. But beneath the lace and the roses, this wasn't a fairy tale. It was the beginning of one of the most scandalous, destructive marriages in British aristocratic history. A union built on money, lies, and desperation. And what happened next would shock even the most cynical members of London's elite. What if I told you one of the most glamorous weddings of the Victorian age was actually built on one of the most expensive lies in British history? Picture it, the wedding breakfast at Seymour Place. Newspapers raved about it. Mountains of flowers, priceless Rothschild china, even members of royalty seated at the table. It all looked like a fairy tale, but here's the part they didn't print behind. The glittering china and carefully posed smiles were sinister. Negotiations, a marriage bought and paid for with contracts so complex they looked more like stock. Deals than vows, the marriage certificate. Sure, it was legal, but it was also a fraud, one of the costliest ever recorded in Victorian society. From the very beginning, the Carnarvon marriage wasn't a union of love. It was a business arrangement with three players, each with their own agenda. Alfred de Rothschild, the banker who bankrolled it all. Almina, the new countess, trapped between ambition and loyalty. George Herbert, the Earl, whose pride was crushed under Rothschild's money. Alfred controlled the finances with genius-level contracts, trusts, allowances, conditional payments, all designed to keep Almina and George dependent on him, while making the Earl look independent. George hated it. Imagine being an aristocrat, supposedly one of the highest-ranking men in Britain, but knowing your entire lifestyle depended on the charity of a man you secretly despised. His resentment grew until it poisoned every part of his life, and that anger? It fell hardest on his wife. Almina, meanwhile, had her own problem. She owed everything to Alfred, but was expected to play the perfect, affectionate countess in public. A smiling ornament at dinners, a hostess at endless parties, a woman of good breeding and charity. The double life wore on her quickly. Observers whispered about her unhappiness. Servants spoke of her sudden fits of temper and impossible demands. Guests noticed the tense silence between husband and wife, even as their entertainment sparkled on the surface. Behind the walls of Highclere Castle, the truth was impossible to ignore. This was a household built on lies, pride, and secrets. George's behavior became reckless. His trips to Egypt, they weren't all about archaeology. In Cairo, he was seen in the city's darkest corners, brothels, opium dens, gambling houses, haunts where wealthy Europeans indulged every forbidden pleasure. Even the locals, used to vice, were shocked at his excess. And then there were the whispers about something even darker. George's hand in the illegal antiquities trade, smuggled artifacts, shady deals, connections with some of the most dangerous players in the Mediterranean underworld. This wasn't a gentleman's pastime anymore. It was criminal. Meanwhile, Almina faced a crisis of her own. On November 7, 1898, she gave birth to a son, Henry Herbert, the heir to the Carnarvon line. The christening at Highclere was a royal affair, celebrated as the triumphant continuation of a great family. But whispers spread almost instantly. The baby didn't look like George, nor did he look like Almina. Instead, some said he had the dark features of Prince Victor Duleep Singh, the exiled son of the Maharaja of Lahore, and George's closest friend since Eton. The gossip was explosive. Could the heir to the Carnarvon title actually be the illegitimate child of an Indian prince? If true, it would have destroyed the family's reputation and thrown the Herbert succession into chaos. But here's where it gets even more twisted. George probably knew, and instead of confronting Almina, he used it. Prince Victor wasn't just charming, he was rich, very rich. His estates in India and his allowance from the British government made him one of the wealthiest bachelors in London. Keeping him close meant money, connections, and influence, things George desperately needed. So George looked the other way. Almina got her secret love. Victor kept his position, and George kept both Victor's wealth and Alfred's financial lifeline flowing into Highclere. It was a deal made of silence, shame, and mutual blackmail. For Almina, though, the cost was personal. Her title, her wealth, her place in society, everything rested on a web of lies. Her marriage was a sham. Her child's legitimacy was questioned, and every day she lived with the fear that one wrong move would shatter it all. To cope, she developed a darker skill set: control, manipulation, collecting secrets about everyone around her and using them like weapons. Friends noticed. Servants whispered. London society began to fear her ability to pull strings, to ruin reputations, to quietly bend people to her will. What started as self-defense evolved into power. Then came the outbreak of World War I in 1914, and Almina saw her chance to reinvent herself. She turned Highclere Castle into a military hospital, hailed as a shining example of aristocratic sacrifice. Newspapers praised her. The public adored her. She was the countess who gave up her castle for wounded soldiers. But behind the patriotic headlines, her old patterns reappeared. Absolute control. Hidden agendas. Exploiting the vulnerable who depended on her charity. Yes, the hospital was real and extraordinary. Patients were treated in luxury. Private rooms with fine linens. Surgeons using the latest technology, even x-rays. It looked like the finest care money could buy. But for Almina, it was never just about charity. It was about power, image, and the same ruthless need to dominate her world. So when you hear about Lady Almina, remember, she wasn't just a glamorous countess or a generous benefactor. She was a woman forged in secrets, lies, and deals made in the shadows. And every step of her rise carried the cost of deception. And what happened next? Let's just say it would shock even the people who thought they already knew the worst. Imagine this. You've just been dragged out of the mud and blood of the trenches in France. And suddenly you wake up in what looks like a palace. Soft beds, gilded rooms, nurses calling you sir and captain. Meals served on fine china that could rival London's best restaurants. It was so surreal that some officers honestly thought they were hallucinating. But behind this dazzling show of aristocratic charity, something much darker was happening. Because here's the truth. Lady Almina's hospitals weren't just about saving lives. They were about building power. Her patients weren't chosen randomly. Not at all. She handpicked them. Officers from powerful families, men with impressive records, or those who could prove useful later. If you were a wounded private, you'd be quietly redirected to a standard military hospital. But if your family sat in Parliament, or you had connections in banking, law, or government, Highclere's doors swung wide open. It wasn't just medicine. It was networking. Every soldier she rescued became a future ally, a debtor tied to her by gratitude. And here's where it gets even more unsettling. Almina's obsession with control seeped into every detail of hospital life. She didn't just oversee medical care. She read patient letters, monitored visitors, even had nurses and servants report on their conversations, every fear, every confession, every scrap of private information. She collected it all like a spider spinning a web. She turned Highclere into a system of surveillance, where even the most personal secrets ended up in her files. And then came the rumors. Late-night visits. A countess in elegant nightwear slipping into patients' rooms, carrying a tray with brandy to help them sleep. She'd sit at their bedside, asking gentle probing questions about their families, finances, relationships, even their deepest fears. Some officers said they felt uncomfortable. Others admitted they revealed things they later regretted. A few whispered about conversations that crossed the line into something disturbingly intimate. What seemed like compassion was really interrogation, and the information she gathered would give her leverage for years to come. Meanwhile, her husband, Lord Carnarvon, was watching this circus unfold from the sidelines. He hated it. Privately, he sneered at Highclere, calling it Carnarvon amputate. But could he stop it? Not a chance. His finances still depended on Alfred de Rothschild, and Almina's reputation as a patriotic benefactor was untouchable. If he spoke against her, he would be branded selfish and unpatriotic. So he stayed silent, stewing in resentment, and then Almina doubled down. She opened a second hospital in London at 48 Bryanston Square, right in the heart of Mayfair. This one catered to a different crowd: foreign officers, diplomats, government officials, and wealthy civilians injured in air raids. And here, the rules were even looser. Patients whispered about being given experimental drugs, treatments that left them dazed, overly talkative, unable to recall what they'd said. Some feared they'd been manipulated into revealing classified details about their governments or personal affairs. It was medicine mixed with espionage, and Almina was at the center of it. She didn't act alone, though. One key figure was Dr. Harold Hendy, the chief medical officer. His past was already littered with scandals involving wealthy women and suspicious medical emergencies. Under his guidance, Almina's hospitals offered services well outside the lines of standard military care, everything from cosmetic surgery for war wounds to hush-hush procedures that were never officially recorded. The lines between treatment, experimentation, and exploitation blurred completely, and through it all, Almina was weaving her web. Officers who pleased her found their careers mysteriously boosted. Promotions, introductions, opportunities that appeared right on time. Those who didn't show proper loyalty, they found rumors dogging them, reputations quietly ruined, doors suddenly closing in their faces. By the end of World War I in 1918, Lady Almina had reinvented herself. No longer just a bought countess, she was now one of the most influential women in London. Behind her stood an army of decorated officers, rising politicians, and wealthy businessmen, men who all owed her something, whether they liked it or not. But she had built this empire on secrets, manipulation, and exploitation. And secrets have a way of exploding. Because soon, her carefully crafted world would collapse in the most dramatic way possible, with the death of Lord Carnarvon in Egypt in 1923. And trust me, that scandal would make everything before look tame. What if I told you that the death of Lord Carnarvon didn't just end a life? It unraveled an entire empire of secrets? Because here's the truth. What mattered more than how he died in Cairo was what happened afterwards. His death shattered the delicate balance of power inside the Carnarvon household. For nearly 30 years, a web of favors, finances, and quiet agreements had kept everything in check. But now, that safety net was gone. Remember, Alfred de Rothschild, Almina's powerful benefactor, had died 5 years earlier in 1918. That left Almina not only wealthy, but completely unrestrained. No husband to temper her schemes, no Rothschild influence to shield her mistakes. Just a widow, alone, rich, and carrying decades of dangerous secrets that enemies could expose at any moment. And Almina wasted no time. Within weeks of returning from Egypt with her husband's body, she started liquidating Rothschild treasures, paintings, jewelry, priceless heirlooms, quietly funneled through discreet dealers and auction houses. The amounts were staggering. Hundreds of thousands of pounds converted into cash she could hide from the taxman, creditors, and even her own family. But here's where things get even darker. Her own son, Henry, the new 6th Earl, was watching. He had inherited not just the title, but also documents. Records that suggested Almina had been siphoning money for years. Money meant for Highclere and the estates had somehow found its way into her personal accounts and shadowy ventures. Henry had also begun digging into his mother's wartime hospitals. And what he uncovered wasn't charity. It was a tangle of financial irregularities and activities that may have broken both medical ethics and criminal law. He knew too much. But here's the problem. Henry shared his father's weakness. He didn't have the courage to confront his mother directly. The result? A silent, bitter Cold War between mother and son. And Henry's eventual betrayal would be devastating. Then came Almina's most shocking move. Just 8 months after Carnarvon's death, in December 1923, she remarried. Not for love, but survival. Her new husband, Lieutenant Colonel Ian Onslow, Dennis Dunn. Dennis was everything Carnarvon wasn't. Young, handsome, charming, reckless, and utterly corrupt. He was drowning in debt, freshly divorced in scandal, and carrying skeletons of his own. His military record looked polished on paper, but underneath was a trail of misconduct that made him dangerous company. Almina had actually met him years earlier in Paris in 1920, while Carnarvon was away in Egypt. Their meeting wasn't chance. It was arranged through go-betweens who specialized in setting up discreet liaisons for the wealthy. From that point on, she bankrolled him heavily. Why? Because Dennis wasn't just a lover, he was a tool. He became her partner in laundering money, moving Rothschild wealth through shell companies, offshore accounts, and military banking systems that hid the true ownership. And yes, witnesses later revealed the affair had begun long before Carnarvon died. Hotels, clubs, even her hospitals had served as rendezvous points. By the time they married, many in London society assumed they already were husband and wife in everything but name. But marriage to Dennis brought another problem. Dorothy, his first wife. Dorothy had lived a twisted life of her own. She had been, in essence, prostituted by Dennis to General Sir John Cowans, the Quartermaster General of the British Army. In exchange for Dorothy's services, Dennis gained promotions, lucrative military contracts, and insider information that made him rich. This arrangement, Dorothy, Dennis, and Cowans, had gone on for years. Even after the war, a grotesque triangle of power, sex, and profit, hidden under a thin veil of respectability. Dorothy, meanwhile, had access to classified military knowledge she could weaponize. So when Dennis married Almina, Dorothy saw her chance. She demanded the alimony she was owed, but her fight wasn't just about money. She knew everything. Dorothy had proof of Dennis and Almina's laundering schemes, their tax evasion tricks, even hints about espionage activities inside Almina's hospitals. And so came the trial of the decade. Dennis Fears Dennis Dunn. March 1925, in London's High Court. For 17 explosive days, the courtroom peeled back layers of corruption, adultery, and crime. Dorothy testified to her arranged prostitution, exposing corruption at the highest military levels. But the spotlight quickly turned to Allman under oath. She was forced to admit to adultery, money laundering, tax evasion, exploiting wounded soldiers, and even participating in illegal medical procedures at her hospitals. The most haunting testimony came from former patients. Officers described being pressured into relationships with the Countess, blackmailed with personal confessions she had extracted at their weakest moments, and coerced into shady financial schemes. Even more shocking, testimony that Almina's London nursing homes had doubled as secret abortion clinics for wealthy women terrified of scandal. Dr. Harold Hendy, protected by immunity, testified that Almina herself had performed dozens of these procedures. Profitable? Absolutely. Dangerous? Without a doubt. By the end, her carefully crafted image of a patriotic nurse and noble benefactor lay in ruins. What emerged instead was a portrait of a woman who had turned charity into crime, who used hospitals not to heal but to control, exploit, and profit. And this was only the beginning of Almina's most destructive years. What if I told you that a courtroom victory could still destroy a person's entire life? That's exactly what happened to Almina, Countess of Carnarvon. Technically, she and her new husband, Dennis Dunn, won the case against his ex-wife, Dorothy. The jury threw out Dorothy's claims for money. But the price of that win? It was catastrophic, because while the verdict went her way on paper, the fallout stripped Almina of everything she'd built, her fortune, her reputation, even her own family's loyalty. The financial hit alone was staggering. Nearly $400,000 in legal bills and court costs, one of the largest judgments of the decade. But money was just the beginning. The real blow came from the scandal. Overnight, London society, which had once tolerated Almina's eccentricities as long as she kept up appearances, shut its doors. Invitations stopped. Former friends pretended not to know her. Charities quietly erased her name from their boards. Even shopkeepers refused her credit, demanding cash up front. And then came the most painful betrayal of all. From her own son. Henry, now the 6th Earl of Carnarvon, used the scandal as an excuse to dig deeper. He launched a private investigation into his mother's finances. What he found was devastating. Decades of embezzlement, fraud, and theft from the very estate she was supposed to protect. Paintings had been swapped for forgeries. Priceless manuscripts sold off to collectors. Family jewels replaced with cheap imitations. Items gifted by monarchs, heirlooms passed down for generations, all gone. Almina had systematically stripped Highclere of its treasures, converting history itself into cash to fuel her lifestyle and schemes. Henry's evidence reached the authorities. And in 1951, the Inland Revenue charged Almina with tax evasion on a scale that shocked even seasoned investigators. Offshore accounts, shell companies, elaborate laundering schemes that had hidden millions for decades. The tax demands wiped out what little remained of her fortune. Bankruptcy followed, exposing her desperation as even trivial household items were seized to satisfy creditors. Her personal life collapsed just as quickly. Dennis Dunn died in 1938, leaving her alone, disgraced, and dependent on the occasional charity of those who pitied her downfall. Attempts to restart her nursing homes failed. Stricter government oversight had ended the kind of shady operations she once ran so profitably. By the 1940s and 50s, she was reduced to trading on a single claim to fame, her connection to Tutankhamun's tomb. She gave lectures, wrote articles, spun tales about her role in Howard Carter's discovery. But the stories grew more exaggerated, more delusional. Audiences quickly realized she couldn't separate fact from fantasy anymore. Her decline was relentless. Poverty, isolation, failing health. A once formidable woman who had controlled millions now lived quietly in a modest Bristol terrace house with Anne Ledbetter, a loyal former employee turned caretaker. And then, in May 1969, it ended almost cruelly. Almina choked on a piece of chicken gristle at dinner. Quick, undignified, almost symbolic for someone who had spent her life consuming far more than she could handle. Money, power, secrets. But even death couldn't silence her chaos. Her will revealed one last act of vengeance. Instead of leaving her estate to Henry or her grandchildren, she gave what little she had to Anne's son, Anthony. To some, it was gratitude for Anne's loyalty. To others, it was revenge. A final snub to the family that had exposed and abandoned her. And then came the discovery that truly cemented her legacy. Thousands of pages of diaries, letters and personal notes. They revealed a woman utterly convinced she'd been the victim, not the villain. Convinced her fraud was justified. Convinced her exploitation was service. Even in her final writings, she cast herself as misunderstood, a martyr to jealousy and ingratitude. But to historians, the truth was undeniable. Almina's life was one of relentless ambition, manipulation, and moral corruption. She had everything, and in the end, lost it all. Her story is more than scandal. It's a warning. Power built on deception always collapses. Lies always catch up. And behind the elegant facades of Britain's aristocracy lay greed, exploitation, and corruption, as ruthless as anything in the modern world. So what do you think? Was Almina Herbert a victim of her circumstances, or the mastermind of her own destruction? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more dark hidden truths from history, hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe. Because as we've just seen, sometimes the real Downton Abbey was far more shocking than fiction.